This is a chart based on Dr. Reif, who had written a book called The Function of the Orgasm. And he postulated that a person cannot be physically or emotionally healthy unless they experience frequent and complete orgasms. He defined orgasm as the capacity for complete discharge of all dammed up, he actually used the words dammed up, sexual excitation through the involuntary pleasurable contractions of the body. And according to him, orgasms are necessary for our physical and emotional health. So he presented this orgasm theory related to the process of an orgasm, how it happens, and what stages are involved. And Masters and Johnson's took it further. And that's what we're seeing here. So we're going to take a look at this, and we're going to look at the stages, and then we're going to look at how I have sort of redrawn them just a little bit to give you some knowledge where you might be able to potentially alter the quality or quantity of your own or others' orgasms. So stage 1, mechanical tension turns into a bioelectric charge, which then becomes stage 3, a bioelectric discharge orgasm, followed by mechanical relaxation. Sounds sexy, doesn't it? Like, seriously, bioelectrical, what? Like, I'm pretty geeky, but that just doesn't really do much for me. So how about you get turned on or excited? You start to feel that delicious sexual tension, which builds and builds. Then suddenly you release it in a tidal wave of pleasure before it subsides, and your entire body relaxes and goes into rest mode. That's essentially what we're seeing here. So if we take a look at the next one that we've got here, here we go. So this is mine. So notice that in this first one, they have taken the excitation and charge and say that's sensuality, whereas release or orgasm and resolution are sexuality. They very specifically have divided this up. And foreplay is this tiny little, start to everything. Then they cordon that off and they say, well, here is where the penetration happens, right? And then the penetration gets us to wherever that orgasm is. And then we have resolution, which to me, this seems incredibly prescriptive. It's telling us that foreplay is this little bit over at the beginning of everything, but all the real stuff happens after penetration, or penetration creates your increase in excitation. I do this differently. I simply say we have 4 stages. We have excitement, sexual tension, release or orgasm, and relaxation. We don't need to divide this up in sensuality or sexuality, because I believe those two things can be totally intermingled throughout the entire process. Obviously, we don't have to put penetration anywhere in here in order for orgasm to happen, for orgasm to be good and valid, for it to be sexual, for it to be sensual. So I've simplified it quite a bit. However, it's important still to understand what this actually looks like, because this tells us a lot about how orgasm functions in the body. And in my book, Next Stop O-Town, I actually have quite a few charts based on this that show different ways of experiencing or not experiencing orgasm. Evos, you just called out the beginning of loss of ego control. And so just so you know, that is actually from their original chart. And I'm going to touch on that here in just a minute, because I think that is interesting and it's really important to understand it. So let's take a gander at these stages. So we start off with excitement. So excitement in the previous version, as you know, the excitement was that tiny little bit at the beginning, and that's where they shoved all the foreplay. Okay, excitement goes here, boys. Put it over there in the corner. And then we've got sexual tension. Now, if you notice, from excitement to sexual tension, it's starting to build, right? Ryan asks, is there a reason why beginning of loss of ego control is accompanied by a yellow arrow? Yes, there is. And I'm going to tell you that in just a minute. Okay, so excitement to sexual tension is beginning to build. It's beginning to create an upward arc, whereas the tip of that arc is going to be our orgasm or our release. Okay, so about halfway up that arc, you're going to see premature ejaculation. So this is the point at which, right in the middle of sexual tension, but before they would normally build up more sexual tension and get to the top of that arc for a full release, premature ejaculation happens there. Now, again, I think it's important to say premature ejaculation is really only a problem if the people in the experience find it to be a problem. If the people in the experience say, great, now that that's out of the way, we can get on with things and have a really good time and not worry about that, it's no problem, right? No problem. However, for a lot of people, it is a problem. And I'm going to pop on over here. Is that? Nope, that's not the one. Okay. So if we take a look here, you can see the arc of what's considered your classic orgasm. And you can see where premature ejaculation and or satiation, because this happens to women as well. It's not just, because premature ejaculation, most people sort of apply that to male genders, but it can happen to any gender. You can get to the point where all of a sudden you haven't really had the orgasm, but you're done, right? For whatever reason, you're done. So I labeled that as premature ejaculation or satiation. And you can see that it peaks highly and quickly and comes down very quickly before you would have drawn out that orgasm. So I wanted to share that with you. And let's go back here. Okay, so as the sexual tension builds, right when it's starting to get to the point of, too full, for lack of a better word, you start to get the point that's been brought up, beginning of loss of ego control. Now, there's a book out there by Naomi Wolf. She wrote a book called Vagina, the New Biography, I believe it was. Great book. But one of the things she talks about in that is that for women, particularly, although it happens in all genders, but the way the brains of most born female-bodied people or assigned female at birth people experience orgasm is they actually, parts of their brain have to shut down in order for them to experience enough tension to get a good orgasmic release. Okay. That's where that beginning of loss of ego control comes into play. And the reason that one has a yellow arrow versus the red arrows of the premature ejaculation or the point of no return is for two reasons. First of all, because it is kind of like a yellow light, right? Once that starts to happen, you're probably going to go all the way over to the point of no return. It's kind of like abandon all hope, ye who enter here, but you haven't actually entered here, all ye's, right? The other reason is because that's also a point where many people who have trouble orgasming have trouble right there at the beginning of loss of ego control. And when I say they have trouble orgasming, I don't mean that they have trouble getting themselves off with, toys or whatever, or that they have trouble experiencing kind of like, oh, that was an orgasm or that was pleasurable, but it wasn't like the big deal. The beginning of loss of ego control, if that doesn't happen, that's when you're going to start getting kind of those duds. And that's going to happen in situations where often you don't trust the partner that you're with. You feel like you need to keep control of the situation that you're in. That's actually sometimes when people are trying very hard to not ejaculate yet, they don't ever lose ego control. And so they actually put themselves into a fit of anorgasmia, or they ruin their tension. So in this case, I've brought up a picture of lack of tension or anorgasmic, where people never actually really build that tension up at all. Whereas there are some people who will get all the way up to that beginning of loss of ego control, but they'll squeeze themselves so hard to keep from ruining it by letting it go over too quickly. And they will keep themselves down below the point of no return, below the heights that they need of tension that they need to reach for orgasm. And they'll make it nearly impossible for themselves to orgasm. Now, again, this is not necessarily a bad thing. For some people, they want that. They want to hit, they want to keep that control, and they want to be able to go for hours and hours and hours, like a jackhammer all night. And some people really love that. And then maybe they get their wild orgasm later, right? However, it's something to keep in mind, because that's something that's really challenging for some people to come back from. Typo time. Can you touch on the concept of edging and orgasm denial and where those would fall on this curve? Absolutely. So, edging. Edging is actually going to be pretty much right up to that beginning of loss of ego control. Because with edging, the whole point is that you need to keep control, right? You need to not let go. You need to not let yourself go beyond that point. Now, you can bump up right next to the point of no return, but that yellow arrow is warning you that going past that, it makes it harder and harder and harder to stop before that point of no return. Orgasm denial, pretty much the same thing. As long as you're able to stop before that point of no return, you're golden. However, something you did not bring up that I'd like to touch on is the ruined orgasm. So if you look at this graphic, you're going to see that we get up, and even at the point of no return, afterwards, it's still going up for a little bit before it hits that orgasmic point. Here's the thing. So for those who are into ruined orgasms, by taking them up right to the point of no return and then removing all stimulation, you see that little point that goes across from point of no return to relaxation starts, and it just cuts the tip off of that orgasmic arc? That's what happens. You hit the point of no return, but you don't, excuse me, actually get the full orgasm. You get the ejaculation, you get the tension release, but you're missing kind of the good stuff, the part you're going for. Now, keep in mind, a lot of people like to be missing that part. They enjoy the disappointment, the letdown, of that. But keep in mind, that's what happens. So you get yourself right to that point. For example, if it's just, you making the scene with a magazine, as Tom Waits put it, you get yourself right to that point. And just as you feel that first throb, hands off, and you just watch it like do its thing, you're missing that extra tip of the orgasm arc. Right? Does that answer your question, type of time? So, point of no return. Just what it sounds like. You're not going to be able to stop it at that point. Point of no return to relaxation, similar to prostate massage. Yes, absolutely. The thing about prostate massage, though, is that in addition, for a lot of people, especially those who have not experienced prostate massage, they miss the fact that stimulating the prostate, even though it doesn't create the same types of feelings that like penis, penis sensation, ejaculatory orgasm brings you, it does create a different type of what could be considered like a full body sensation orgasm. So they're going to miss that genital focused feeling and get more of a diffuse body pleasure type of feeling. So yeah. Okay, let's see. Excellent. Wanted to make sure I got that. So point of no return. Now, after the point of no return, you can see it still keeps climbing till you hit orgasm. And that's an absolutely wonderful thing. Because the orgasm itself, that is like, kind of the big bar there. And then right under orgasm, it stops to drop down. You get cessation of excitation and automatic motion. So that's very scientific for somewhere between beginning of loss of ego control and relaxation starts. You get a lot of involuntary motion, sounds, feelings, right? You start, like kind of squirming and making noises and panting, and maybe you sweat a little bit. And so after you reach that orgasm, the cessation of excitation and automatic motion is when you stop throbbing or jerking around or twitching or whatever. Now, so in some, what's the word I'm looking for? Communities, they talk about, especially in those where they make orgasm kind of like a badge of pride for men, which in and of itself is not a bad thing specifically. It's the use to which they put that particular badge of pride. But in some communities, they talk about, well, how do you know if someone has orgasms and they're not just faking it? And one of the ways they talk about that is they talk about the involuntary motions, the pulsing of a penis or of the vaginal canal will often involuntarily squeeze and release. So will, in all genders, the anus. For many people, the anus will pulse and release throughout orgasm. So as you get over on the other side of orgasm, you're going to realize that you're coming into relaxation when your involuntary motions cease. Now, let's also talk about something else. There is for some people, this actually happens to me. For some people, once they get into orgasm, their entire body can involuntarily react. And after the orgasm begins to subside, they can have what I've termed, and I've heard others agree with, aftershocks, where literally their entire body, like their stomach muscles, will crunch up and create like kind of like additional aftershock orgasms and experiences. So for some people, between orgasm and cessation of excitation, there's a very long period there where the orgasm can continue for several minutes because of the way the body is reacting. It tensing and releasing and tensing and releasing and tensing and releasing. Because again, if you look at what we're talking about here with orgasm, sexual tension and release. So, Oyen Iku says, whether solo or partnered, I fall off in between loss of ego and point of no return if traced back to embarrassment in my youth. Yeah, so there's always a spot in here where we can look and we can say, oh, maybe this is what's happening here. Maybe I can see, maybe I've had some issues in the past there. This is meant to give you sort of a roadmap to be able to explain to your partner or to yourself how this works for you or how it doesn't work for you. And, because if you get all the way to beginning of loss of ego control and point of no return, there is a whole lot of pleasure that can be had in there. And explaining that to them and saying, here is, where I might have an issue. However, we can still create a lot of pleasure through this, and we can keep me going in this pleasure is really critical. Being able to talk about that. Fitmiss says, but Nookie, we can fake involuntary contractions too. Shh. You're not supposed to tell them that. Jojo, I've felt a little tingly feeling in my vagina when I'm being pleased through anal, but I haven't really felt my anus pulse. I take it that's just me, especially when I'm having an anal orgasm. Okay, so one thing to keep in mind, Jojo, every single thing I talk about this evening is subject to your personal experiences. When I'm talking about this, I'm going to be talking about generic, average responses. And then I can also talk about, here are some things that could happen, right? So you may not be feeling it. One thing, though, that, and I don't know your experience or whatever, but just thinking about people who might be, watching this and not asking that question, or who might be listening to the audio version of this in replay at some point, is the people who tend to feel those involuntary contractions the most strongly happen to be those with the strongest Kegels. So those who, and that's actually something I recommend and talk about quite a bit in the Big Book of Ass and in my Learn to Love Anal class, is exercising your Kegels for greater sexual pleasure. Because having stronger Kegels and being able to clamp down and release more effectively can actually add to sexual pleasure quite a bit, regardless of your gender, because the Kegels also help control the way penises move and feel, and also all genders have buttholes, right? And the Kegels do affect how the anus reacts to penetration and pleasure. So, yeah. Kegel exercises are for everyone, Fitmiss. Absolutely. And it is possible that some people have just not noticed that they are twitching down there, because I mean, honestly, when you're laying there in bed starfishing after, a really good orgasm, the last thing you're thinking is my butthole winking at my partner?